On behalf of the Lower Merion Historical Society, I thank you for your interest in this presentation by author Julia Steinberg Agnew on her newly published book, Frank Miles Day, The Life, Work, and Legacy of a Philadelphia Architect. My name is Erin Betley, an officer with the Lower Merion Historical Society. Since 1949, the Society has served as a vital force in preserving and sharing the rich heritage of Lower Merion and Narberth through the collection and stewardship of historical documents and items, as well as through community education and programs just like this. The Society is an independent nonprofit organization funded through memberships and donations, and you can find much more information about the Society at our website, lowermerionhistory.org. Without further ado, I'll introduce our presenter. Julia grew up in New England and moved to Philadelphia in 2003 to attend graduate school. She worked in the city's public schools primarily as a kindergarten teacher and now works in higher education training for urban educators. Her book is a product of a lifetime of interest in the arts, architecture, preservation, and conservation, and of a career spent incorporating the arts and sciences into classroom learning. She lives with her family in Wynwood and can often be found cheering for her children at sporting events or digging in her garden.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. In the last year, I published this work, Frank Miles Day, The Life, Works, and Legacy of a Philadelphia Architect, and I'll be sharing how this book came to be. I have a few goals in doing so. One is to convince you anyone can dive into research. I am not an architectural historian, and I'll begin by sharing a few tools and resources that helped me with this work. And the next goal is to share some of what I've learned about Day's life and works in order to convince you of his significance in the history of Philadelphian and American architecture and preservation. And then my third goal is to convince you to go out and explore his extant works like I did. This concept of sending people out to experience architecture in person was actually one of Day's missions. He was determined to send American architectural students to study classical architecture abroad, just as he did. Now I think we have greatness right here worthy of exploration. And I know that experiencing these places in real life is far more powerful than viewing them on a screen, but we'll begin with the screen. I'll start by sharing the story of how this book came to be. It's really a family story. I have 3 kids, twins, Ralph and William, who are now 9, and a daughter, Greta, who's now 13, in middle school, and a very supportive husband. The story begins with Greta's advocacy of a historic place and ends with a book with a cover designed by William on my parents' front porch. While I was digging for photos for this presentation, I found this gem. It perfectly describes Greta at the time when this all began, in the fall of 2022. Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful. I had heard about a property called Oakwell out in Villanova that was owned by the local public schools. It was adjacent to Stoneleigh, a property managed by Natural Lands that we had been visiting for years as a family, frolicking in the gardens. A group of local residents had been protesting the school's plans for this property since the spring before and was now offering tours as a way to help inform the public. The structures on the property were said to be designed by Frank Miles Day. About 20 years prior, when I'd first driven from the Boston area to Philadelphia to scout out places to live during graduate school, I was to study to become a teacher, I entered West Philadelphia by way of the South Street Bridge off 76, and I remember it like it was yesterday. You know, Penn Museum on your left, Franklin Field on the right, you round the corner, and there's the Collegiate Gothic Waitman Hall. I loved it. The warm brick, the European influences, those arches. Shortly thereafter, I learned the architect associated with these buildings was Frank Miles Day. So in the fall of 22, when I heard the structures at Oakwell were designed by the same person, I thought, wait, what? What's this connection? He designed a museum, a sports arena, and now some outbuildings on an estate in Villanova. Who was this guy? Greta has always been up for anything and interested in historic places, so she agreed to go with me and check out Oakwell. And so, on a crisp fall day, off I went with my then 9-year-old daughter, fearless and powerful, though unbeknownst to her mother at this point. We were to meet for this tour in the parking lot of Stoneleigh. Our tour guide introduced herself and explained this property, Oakwell, that we were to visit had originally been part of Stoneleigh, and subdivided years later. She described its ecological significance as an animal habitat and its role in the watershed. It contained mature trees, some quite possibly as old as our country. And it had historical significance. The owner of Stoneleigh, Eleanor Bodine, had used this side of the property for a garden complex. And this complex, back in the early 1900s, housed a horticultural training program for women. Imagine that, women in science. The guide then explained the current situation. The school district had seized the property by eminent domain and planned to tear down the structures and cut down the trees to use the space for turf playing fields. Well, even before the tour began, my daughter was all fired up. Her district was doing this. This is a disgrace. I'm writing a letter to the superintendent. Take a breath, Greta. And then this is what we saw on the tour. You may recall that moment in the secret garden when Mary Lennox circles the brick wall, wondering what's beyond. It was like we were reliving that moment. And there was more. And what you can't see here are the magical, almost fairy tale-like garden paths with surprises around every corner. So it wasn't just the brick structures or the charming arts and crafts style dormitory called Squirrel Inn or the gardens that got us. It was the whole combination. A story about women in science, the monumental trees, wildlife, a walled garden straight out of Burnett's novel. And after the tour, sure enough, my daughter wrote a letter to the superintendent. I shared it by email with the tour guide for a giggle. Little did I know what a connected tour guide this was. There was a student advocacy group that had been showing up at school board meetings, and there was a meeting scheduled for the next night. Well, the Oakwell tour guide shared Greta's letter with this student group, who then read her letter at that school board meeting. You should have seen our looks of disbelief as we watched on Zoom. We had no idea this would happen. Well, Greta only received one email in response to her letter, and that wasn't enough for this kid. So she convinced me to leave soccer practice early a month later and stay up well past her bedtime, she was only 9, to attend the next school board meeting, to address the superintendent and board head on. Which she did, and she was great, as I looked on from the back row, shaking with nerves. Emboldened by my daughter and determined to answer her calls, "Mom, we need to do more," I soon connected with another local parent, Erin Betley. Erin had conducted the historical research about the property and was helping to organize the student advocacy group. I asked what I could do to help. She mentioned she could use a hand finding ways to share her research with the public, and so that's what we did. We created a website to house all of the information about the property. We began a Facebook group specific to educating the public about its historical and ecological significance, with all sorts of Women's History Month posts, posting letters of advocacy, then hosting events on site at Oakwell like a bio blitz with a terrific turnout pictured here. And Greta's brothers, then kindergartners, they were all in too. Public, student-led tours followed, more protests. When we lost access to the site, Erin coordinated a speaker series with Villanova science professors. We certainly proved that place had value. Now, back in the fall, we had tracked down Patricia Heinzelman Keebler, who had written her dissertation about Day back in 1980 at the University of Delaware. While many archives contained images of the architect's works and his writings, her dissertation remained the most comprehensive source of research about Day over 40 years later. Pat, now retired, was completely unaware she remained the main academic writer on Frank Miles Day, the sole writer, really, and she toured Oakwell with us. She reaffirmed our belief that these works were historically significant and worthy of preservation. Neither of us could understand why local historical groups hadn't applied for historic designation. The State Historic Preservation Office website seemed to imply anyone could nominate a property to the State Register of Historic Places, so I began to toy with the idea of nominating Oakwell myself. It seemed like a designation would be a good way to alert the public to its historical significance, and maybe even make the school district at least question their decision. My mom, with a background in historic preservation, could help me with some of the architectural descriptions, and Erin had already written up much of the cultural context. Pat was very pleased with our interest in this architect's work, and with her blessing, I got going on the paperwork and soon submitted a nomination to the state, and waited and waited. And we found out mid-February 2023 that not only was Oakwell deemed eligible for the state and national register, but the entire Stoneleigh Oakwell complex was deemed eligible as a district. And when a property is deemed eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, while not yet formally listed, it is recognized as a historic resource. And it felt like we won the lottery. I was told by a local conservancy this was merely honorary, but it sure meant a lot to us. We continued on with programming and supporting the student advocates. Later that spring, the student group was even awarded a Township Go for the Green Award that recognized them for their service to the community. There was a ceremony at Appleford on a beautiful spring night, and if anyone was there, you know it got a little tearful. Lots of joy, lots of hope. Natural Lands thoughtfully kept us in the loop as we anxiously awaited an announcement about Oakwell's fate. In October of 2023, we got a sneak peek at a newly donated portrait of Eleanor, Our Lady of Horticulture. We were given a secret tour of the house, every nook and cranny, complete with rooftop views. In April of 2024, Lower Merion School District announced the sale of Oakwell, and by August, we knew the sale was to Natural Lands. Hooray! Last April, 2025, we were invited back to Stoneleigh for a community planning meeting for Oakwell, hosted by Natural Lands, which was truly surreal. Little Greta at the head of the table in the boardroom, spinning on the wheelie chair. Pat had told me she'd always felt badly she never promoted Frank more, and that seemingly few people knew his name. So I thought I'd whip together a book. She told me to use her dissertation, and I thought I'd simply cite her research and find better photos. It'd be easy. Back in October of 2023, I began with the Images of America group, the sepia tone photo books, and I liked this concept because it would be accessible to the public. They sell them everywhere. Plus, I liked the concept of telling his story in pictures. I knew people who'd written these and claimed it was easy. So I had a contract with them. However, the more I researched, the more I found to be of interest. And it was the magnitude, the breadth of his work that fascinated me about Frank Miles Day. In addition to his architectural designs, he was an unbelievable writer and orator, known as incredibly organized, detail-oriented, and a well-regarded manager and business person. He had many interests relating to the arts and natural world and a lifelong interest in historic preservation, which, of course, made me feel even better about our efforts to preserve his architecture at Oakwell. And this was really one of the main reasons I felt he should be remembered. And his wife was stellar. I wanted to include all of this in whatever book I pieced together. Now, I quickly realized I was unable to communicate all that I wanted to share about Day's life and projects through 50 or so images. I really had too much content. Also, these books are intended to be hyper-local, so I would need to eliminate much content related to works outside of Philadelphia for this type of publication, which I didn't want to do. So I shifted to writing a more detailed, comprehensive text. As my family was growing tired of all this and boring Frank, as they called him, self-publishing seemed to be the quickest, simplest option, the best option for my family. I used Amazon's KDP program, and I have some ethical regrets, but it was an easy process overall. And now for a little bit about the research process. Since I wanted to tell the story in images, I began by finding free public domain images. You'd be amazed how expensive it can be to use single high-res images from online archives. The sources in bold are online archives where I found the bulk of my material, generally primary sources, photographs, periodicals, his own publications, and those from his era. And Ancestry.com, what a treasure trove. There's a lot you can learn from an obit, travel documents, census records, newspapers. and I always had a browser window open to geohistory and the Philly History website with photos. These, with atlases and images of historic Philadelphia, allowed me to have a better sense of the city as it existed in Day's time. Luckily, most of Day's designs were published in the T-Square catalog, and the Free Library of Philadelphia has them in their collection. I regularly visited the art department where I had immersed myself in old volumes of the T-Square Club catalogs and issues of House and Garden, a magazine Day and his friends founded. As a result, I have about 600 photos of books at strange angles, trying to photograph images I wasn't allowed to scan without shadows that I could later crop. I compiled these photos and others taken of structures in person and others I scrounged together from the internet and put them between two covers. And now I have a book that serves both as a catalog of his work and as a cultural study. And a quick aside, the T-Square Atelier sign you see on the left, just before I went to the library for the first time, a woman behind the desk in the art department had found this sign. It had been set on the loading dock to be trashed. She happened to think it looked cool, grabbed it, stuck it aside. And she was delighted when I pointed it out, sitting there on the floor, and explained the club and its significance. So we put it up on display with the catalogs. I eventually created a map that allows you to see all of his extant works and demolished works that I'll share with you at the end of this presentation. Over 90 sites you could visit. These range from private residences, townhomes, sprawling estates, to churches, college campuses. The majority are in the Mid-Atlantic region, and this should give you a sense of the amount of information I intended to gather, plus all sorts of structures had been demolished, and I wanted to write about those too. I obviously began with Keebler's dissertation. After that, as a novice researcher, I really didn't know where to begin. Call me weird, but I started off by snooping around West Laurel Hill Cemetery on a morning walk. I wanted to check out his grave, and I am so glad I did. It's this gravestone that really set me on this wild adventure, researching his life and works more deeply. The inscription reads, "Keen in intellect with force and skill, to strive, to fathom, to fulfill, a life in civic action warm, a soul on highest mission sent." With a little digging, I realized these lines are a reworking of a verse from Tennyson's 1850 Requiem, a compilation of 133 poems written over the course of 17 years for a beloved college friend who died in early adulthood, imagining what his friend's career could have been had he lived. Well, this grave was so much more than the average headstone. It illustrated the day's desire to be remembered for their intellect, civic action, maybe their love for the written word, maybe their mutual admiration. And I can say now, without hesitation, that after researching this couple, their deaths were both a personal and societal loss, just like that of Tennyson's friend. Their son's family grave is beside, engraved with another line from Tennyson, from his poem Crossing the Bar, coincidentally, the subject of my first and favorite college essay. The sentimentality all around made it hard for me to resist feeling affection for these strangers. From there, I went down an awful lot of rabbit holes, but it was worth it. The more I looked up about different properties, people, organizations, the more connections I made and the better picture I had of my architect and his world. And now I'll walk you through some of the first connections I dug into, besides this crazy grave stuff. When I read the inscription on the grave, I immediately needed to learn more about the couple buried here and their civic action. In 1896, Frank Miles Day married Anna Blanchard Blakiston. Who was she? I knew that a Philadelphia school around the corner from where I'd once taught had been named for her, A.B. Day. But why? In what civic action did she participate? Well, much can be found about his wife, Anna Day. I smushed a whole lot here, while she really deserves her own presentation, or book. Anna was the third daughter of Presley Blakiston, owner of a successful publishing house. Anna followed in the way of her older sisters, Emma and Mary, in terms of civic action. Emma and Mary were entrenched in the playground movement and efforts to provide educational experiences to women in the field of horticulture. Anna became a leader in the movement to clean up local government with the Women's League for Good Government. She also became a leader in child labor reform, both locally and nationally, and later, the suffrage and peace movements. The especially fun discoveries were the connections between the Day family and the Blakistons and Stoneleigh Oakwell. We knew from Erin's research that Bodine's wife Eleanor, who sometimes looked like this, and later looked like this, was also involved in the education of young women in the field of horticulture, not only opening up her gardens for tours in support of the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women, but also by hosting her own training program for young women on her property with the dormitory and all. Interestingly, the Blakiston sisters did too. They were instrumental in the founding of the school and even moved out there, often hosting students in their home, which was, of course, a farmhouse redesigned by Day on the edge of campus. Now, a little bit about the architecture. I recognized upon my first visit to Oakwell common stylistic elements in Day's designs. It's not hard to realize, even with a limited understanding of architecture. There was this term, creative eclectic, used by Day and some of his contemporaries, a mixture of elements from previous historical styles, to create something new and original. Specific motifs were repeated, classical motifs like arches and starbursts, other interesting combinations of motifs from around the world, influences from his father's homeland, England, and other architecture he observed during his years of study abroad. And then I started to connect a cast of characters. There was Bodine, owner of the Stoneleigh estate in Villanova, and executive of UGI, the United Gas Incorporated. A little digging and another trip to West Laurel Hill, and I realized his father-in-law was William Gray Warden, one of the founders of the Standard Oil Company. So these were oil guys, big money, buddies with Rockefeller and Flagler. And then, pressing my nose against the glass of the Warden Mausoleum, I started recognizing names. Wait, that's John Ketterlinus of the publishing house. Why is he in there? Turns out, he married one of Warden's daughters. It was all starting to make sense. Frank designed for Bodine, or rather, Warden's daughter, Eleanor Gray Warden Bodine. For her dad, William Gray Warden, a large townhouse in Philadelphia, and a winter home in St. Augustine, alongside Flagler's Hotel, and a summer home in Bar Harbor for another one of Warden's daughters and her husband, Ketterlinus, who, together, would later own the Warden Winter Home. Warden seemed to be a central figure. It began to seem likely, considering the timeline, that the Warden Florida Commission would have led to those with other wealthy clients, Bergner, Newbold, Yarborough, and possibly relationships with Henry Houston and his daughter Gertrude and her husband George Woodward, developing Chestnut Hill. This made sense because the design for the Warden Winter Home was in 1887, the same year Day made his debut with a design for the Art Club, entering into Philadelphia's architectural scene. Day, whose name wasn't even known before he won this competition, quickly became the hottest new architect in Philly. Warden scooped him up, as you do, to design his winter home. Now, not only were there connections between clients, there seemed to be connections between Day and local artists and reformers that I was dying to dig into. I knew Frank had designed a home called Cogsley up in Chestnut Hill for a group of women artists, Violet Oakley, Jessie Wilcox Smith, and Elizabeth Shippen Green, and their friend Henrietta Cousins, a horticulturist and the house manager. These women had been nicknamed by their instructor, Howard Pyle, the Red Rose Girls, when they moved from their city studio on Chestnut Street to the Red Rose Inn in the country for some peace and quiet. When I looked at the atlas from 1900, turns out the Red Rose Inn was just down the road from Stoneleigh. There had to be some connection more than just client-architect, right? Not to mention the backdrop of their illustrations of children and homes and gardens sure do recall Day's architecture and landscapes. And it turns out they were much more than client-architect. They were close friends. Oakley painted his portrait not once but twice, the one on the left with Cogsley in the background in 1910, and then on the right for the National Academy of Design in 1912. And it was said the Day children, Francis and Kenneth, even modeled for the Red Rose girls. And on auction websites, you never know what you'll find. This was a lot passed down from a Day descendant with books, with presumably illustrations for which the Day's children sat, illustrated by Jessie Wilcox Smith, along with some of her sketches and oils used for magazine and book illustrations. And with a poem with all of their signatures. Sure enough, the Red Rose girls were close friends with the Days, and this 1907 Christmas poem, Ode to Friendship, is certainly proof. And those letters in the signature Gothic font used by Violet Oakley? Just like those I'd seen on Day's grave, which I'm pretty sure must be her design. She's said to have written a poem at the time of his death, which I've yet to find, either in a publication or in the online auction catalogs like these other treasures. The Red Rose girls and Days were neighbors, as the poem read, and while today that seems like a stretch since there are several streets between their homes, you saw it was meadow, maybe woods, in the illustration, and a simple fence that divided the properties. When you realize that in 1903 this neighborhood wasn't even in the atlas, it really was off the beaten track, you can see why they considered themselves neighbors. Even in 1910 it was pretty rural, so you can imagine their proximity might have led to a special type of bond. So I knew Day had this friendship with the Red Rose girls. I sensed Frank had a deep connection to the art scene. His name was popping up in all sorts of catalogs and club membership lists. I started to look more deeply into his involvement in Philadelphia's art scene. I knew he worked at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but in what capacity? Turns out, he worked alongside Cecilia Beaux and William Merritt Chase, and I was mind-blown when I dug into the archives and realized the extent of his involvement. He became a faculty member in 1899 and taught and lectured as an instructor in perspective until 1916 for the Day Life and Head course, the Day Antique course, the Afternoon Women's Life course, the Men's Night Life course, and the Night Antique course. And this was not teaching architecture. These were courses intended for painters. He was also supportive of his niece, artist Bertha Corson Day, and close friends and travel companions with Charles Dana, a fellow watercolorist and instructor in architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. I found that he had written much in appreciation of the fine arts and expressing commitment to upholding architecture as the full embodiment of all the fine arts. And so this involvement in art education makes sense, and it speaks to his expertise on the subject of perspective, not just expertise in architecture, as well as to his commitment to supporting the education of both men and women in the arts. These were only a few of the many connections Day had with artists. Through academic connections, art club committees, judging competitions in Philadelphia and beyond, Day had quite a remarkable network of colleagues and friends. He developed friendships with other artists with whom he collaborated, including the finest craftsmen of the time, with sculptor John B. Boyle, a former student of Eakins at PAFPA, with whom he collaborated for a Benjamin Franklin statue, which is now at Penn. Day did much work for the Fairmount Arts Commission, including a collaboration with sculptor Daniel Chester French for a General Grant statue. You know French's work if you've ever seen the larger marble statue of Abraham Lincoln within the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Day designed this monumental base out of pink Jonesboro granite from Maine, same as his father's headstone. You can see the fanfare for the unveiling. It was over the weekend of Dewey Day, the anniversary of Admiral Dewey's 1898 victory in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. Grant still grazes over Kelly Drive, and I hope you'll notice him the next time you pass by. And of course, Day had many close connections in the architectural world. Charles McKim of Boston became a close confidant as they worked together to establish the American Academy in Rome. Day was actively involved in the Philadelphia AIA and National, and especially instrumental in the selection and rehab of the 1798 Octagon House, still the national headquarters for the AIA. As a result of that experience, as well as his years abroad, he formed friendships with leading British architects across the pond. Edwin Lutyens, known for imaginative adaptations of traditional English residential architecture, and his work with horticulturist Gertrude Jekyll to create natural-style gardens and landscape ornament. George Bodley, then known for his Gothic Revival ecclesiastical designs, now known in the U.S. for his design for the National Cathedral. Sir Aston Webb, to whom he awarded the very first AIA gold medal, known for the facade of Buckingham Palace. As I said, I had way too much for a small picture book. So how did Day, this well-respected and connected person in the field of architecture, become? Clearly, this person had a strong foundation. Frank was born in 1861, the youngest son of Anna Miles Day and Charles Day. He spent much of his childhood traveling Europe and spending summers in Maine, pictured here, and studying at Rittenhouse Academy. But mostly he studied with his retired father, an Englishman by birth, and a naturalist. Frank attended the University of Pennsylvania on their new West Philadelphia campus. He was enrolled in the architectural program of the town scientific school, and here's an example of a text he would have had. Color harmony and theory were studied, as well as the principles of frame and masonry construction. He was also an athlete and actively involved in campus organizations. He graduated as valedictorian in 1883. He would have led the graduation parade pictured on the right. Commencement was held on Broad Street at the Academy of Music, and the graduates and professors marched from campus down Broad Street. At the time of his graduation, he learned his father was ill and went to England where he was living. His father died shortly thereafter. Frank remained in England to begin postgraduate study. He attended several different architectural programs, experiencing different methods, pedagogies, with exposure to both traditional and modern thinking in this field. And he then apprenticed in the offices of two well-known London-based architects. Millard, an expert in construction and design of medieval-styled buildings, as well as in the restoration of old buildings. Champneys, an expert in Gothic architecture. In between courses, especially in the spring and summer months, Day traveled Europe, sketching architectural details in each location. He sketched, and he sketched. He accumulated a substantial collection of meticulously kept sketchbooks, which he illustrated cover to cover, complete with dates, location, narration. The volume and detail of sketches implies he sketched nearly nonstop throughout these travels, and seeing them is exhilarating. These sketches were especially exciting to see when I realized how they directly influenced his architectural designs in Philadelphia. These are from his travel journals. He was interested in architectural details as well as the preservation of historic structures. Day returned to the U.S. in 1886 and promptly joined the T-Square Club, which I mentioned earlier. Has anyone heard of the T-Square Club? Apart from I mentioned earlier? The club began as an informal association of young architects who met to sketch and exchange ideas. It quickly grew into an important vehicle for the encouragement of architectural education through competition and classes, many free to the public. When Frank Miles Day joined the T-Square Club in 1886, the club did not have an official clubhouse. Meetings were held in the architectural offices of various members, or in pubs, and it wasn't until 1891 that the club realized its ambition to have quarters of its own, when they occupied an attic of an old house at 29 North 13th Street, which I think must be this. The club had annual competitions and later exhibitions too. In fact, the first exhibition was held at PAFA in 1896, which happens to be the same year Day was vice president of the club and the year he became full-time faculty. It was among fellow members of the T-Square Club that Frank Miles Day developed ideas for the profession, exhibitions, and this creative eclectic design, using a mixture of elements from previous historical styles, specifically those he recorded in his sketchbooks, to create something new and original. They created long-lasting professional relationships and friendships, in particular with the three pictured here: Wilson Eyre Jr., Walter Cope, and John Stewardson. The fourth image is Day. When I was considering what to present, my mom said, well, you can't share all of his work in an hour. So I immediately took that as a challenge, but I really couldn't make that work. My mom is always right. I spent 2 years dragging my family along to visit and research Day's designs in no particular order. The Princeton campus designs on the way to a friend's in Short Hills, a winter vacation to the Bedford Springs Hotel, stopping by Chestnut Hill and Mount Airy, designs on our way to hikes in the Wissahickon. The first places I checked out, however, were right here in Lower Merion, and what a sampling of his work these extant structures are. They beautifully represent his work, his creative eclecticism, his own different styles and periods, as well as his ethos. They highlight his interest in the picturesque, in landscape design, and his attention to form and function, and all are in terrific condition. The oldest extant build in our area is the Stevenson residence. This was his second design for a residence in Merion, and it's certainly representative of his creative eclectic period with use of vernacular materials. The home displays features of both the American Queen Anne and shingle style movements, consists of a main block with sheltering porches broken by a turreted bay, covered by a prominent roof, a heavy first story of varied yellow-toned fieldstone, topped by upper stories in a lighter natural shingle, now painted. Curved stone walls, flared pillars of the lower porches, and the small roof dormers with a steeply pitched gabled roof. In a series of articles from Mainline Times titled Growing Up in Merion in the 1890s, Stevenson's daughter, Mary Ann Olson, told of her childhood on South Highland Ave. She described the isolation of the house when first built. Apart from these residences, it was only Supley's dairy farm, fields of wildflowers in the Wynwood Woods between her home, City Line Ave, and the St. Borromeo Seminary. It's possible that this design was a response to the house design of their one and only neighbor, the 1888 Haskell House designed by Frank Furness next door. While not Victorian in style, Day's design complements the Furness in its use of materials such as stone and shingle, and its pointed turret mirrors the pointedness and verticality of the Furness gables and chimneys. Day's version, however, with its curves and more stocky nature, creates an effect more similar to that of a picturesque cottage. In the Stevenson design, we also see his interest in vernacular materials, in this case, local stone. As seen in his school design and 3 residences in Chestnut Hill for developer George Woodward, his twins on Lincoln Drive, also built for Woodward, and in the Wall Garden House, a summer cottage designed for Gertrude Woodward on the edge of their estate. Use of vernacular materials was a must for Day throughout his entire career. Even one of his last designs, a design for the University of Colorado Boulder campus, used a local stone. It was described as Tuscan vernacular, but Day and Clowder simply called this University of Colorado style. And why wouldn't you use the local stone when it's this beautiful color? But back to the Stevenson design. This is one of many of Day's picturesque designs for a country estate. Similar in many ways to the Kennedy House and Stable in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, or what was known as Bradford Hills, and can certainly be compared to more urban homes designed in the same period. Even the Ketterlinus summer home up in Maine. And you can see that the Stevenson house has an interior very similar to Ketterlinus. I couldn't help but notice the stocky columns either, a favorite of Day's. Stuccoed stocky columns at Cogsley and at his own home too. Now Day was of the mind that a carriage house should serve its function yet possess elegance worthy of its vehicles. Also, a stable was not merely a storehouse, but needed to be a well-designed structure that would serve as a supply storage, house animals, and provide a comfortable living space. Before the days of horseless carriages, the Stevenson family owned an impressive assortment of horse-drawn carriages, pony carts driven by coachmen, passenger coaches, supply wagons. It's likely this collection is thanks to Stevenson's neighbor, George Woodward Haskell, who had made his fortune in a family carriage manufacturing business, Haskell and Brothers. which I discovered during a deep dive into a carriage factory designed by Day for another company. The stable functioned as a harness room and a big carriage room for the cotunder, pictured here, a distinctly Philadelphia-style wagon for station use. There was a stall for the family's cow, and above the stalls were a hired man's room, tidied daily by a maid from the house, and bags of feed and bales of hay for the animals that were hoisted by pulley from delivery wagons. Mary Ann Olson described how the cow and chickens were essential, quote, "for no milkman made rounds, and no store was nearer than the center of the city." Supplies came by train from the famous 12th Street Market. The big hampers, duly tagged, were pushed from the train onto the platform of the baggage house at every station along the line and had to be collected by every residence's station wagon. Life on the main line. This relatively modest home and stable for a man of Stevenson's worth reflects the owner's values. While he made his fortune in the woolen yarn business with his father and brothers, he intended to use this fortune to destroy the unfair systems that had allowed him to gain such wealth. He became an outspoken promoter of the single tax reform movement. This concept was popularized by Philadelphian Henry George, who, in his 1879 publication, Progress and Poverty, maintained that the increase in population and demand for natural resources caused the value of land to increase and skewed wealth toward the elite. A solution to this was a single tax so the value of land could benefit the whole community rather than serve as a source of wealth for private individuals. The majority of the wealthy and lawmakers opposed this concept. In 1896, Stevenson and 13 of his comrades from Dover, Delaware, were imprisoned for 30 days for protesting. This movement led to the 1897 formation of the Philadelphia Vacant Lots Cultivation Association by Joseph Fels, a fellow supporter of the single tax, who demonstrated how the poor could help themselves if land was not held idle for speculation by lending out abandoned lots in the city for working-class families to farm. Connections to other Georgian clients, combined with details of Day's life, suggest he too may have been sympathetic to their cause. In fact, Day seemed to have many reformers in his list of clientele. For instance, Day also designed a residence for Nicolas Dubois Miller, a horticulturist with notable rose and perennial gardens, but also a concerned citizen. Partners and solicitor for Theodore Starr, a local philanthropist active in the playground movement, and interested in improving the area between Spruce and South Streets from 7th Street west to the Schuylkill River, an area housing immigrants and the largest African-American population in the city. Miller was also instrumental in reorganizing the House of Refuge when it relocated 20 miles west of Philadelphia to Glen Mills. This was an alternative to prison for Philadelphia's youth, founded in 1826. It was set on a 750-acre campus on a property over double that size, with all the amenities of an elite boarding school. There's more in the book. In 1894, at the same time as Day was involved in the Penn Museum at 34th and Spruce, he took a commission for a home of industry in West Philadelphia. A little digging, and I uncovered that this home was to provide shelter and opportunity for former convicts, a new reform effort led by former convict Michael Dunn, and one of the first of its kind for men. So that's a wrap on Stevenson. A country house to escape the hot city, built in the creative eclectic style, picturesque massing, vernacular materials, interior woodwork, colonial revival, intricate paneling, balusters, spindles, and housing a client involved in a reform movement, one of many clients and family members interested in the betterment of society. And then, of course, Lower Merion has 3 structures at Stoneleigh Oakwell from about 1901. The bottom 2 photos here are actually different angles of the same structure. The Bodines had purchased Stoneleigh, a Victorian manse on a 65-acre estate out in Villanova in about 1900. They upgraded the facade and interior, and, with well-known landscape architects Ferrucci Vitale and later the Olmsted brothers, Eleanor Bodine planned a massive garden complex. Of course, it's her husband's name here in the atlas. They hired Frank Miles Day to design structures that would complement this landscape. The result was a masterful balance between green space and brickwork. As a whole, the design of the structures adheres to the three principles to which he subscribed throughout his career: the union of architectural style and horticulture, the garden serving as an extension of the house, and the house and garden simultaneously enhancing each other's beauty. One of these structures was an Asian-inspired tea house covered in wisteria vines, accessed by Stoneleigh by Linden Lane. Originally, the gardens were meant for the enjoyment of guests, and this tea house was part of that experience. It was built into the landscape not far from these other structures, with long brick walls, arches, and Jacobean curves corresponding with those you'll see in the greenhouse complex, and those you see at Houston Hall at Penn, and in a few slides on another residence in Lower Merion. Day made use of vernacular materials, but it is creative eclectic in style with the unusual mix of arches, Doric columns, and a wooden Greek key meander. Styles taken straight from his sketches from his studies abroad. I want to point out the long, flat roofline and overhang here, quite similar to the one we see in the dog hospital he designed for UPenn. And what a stark contrast between this design and the rest of the campus buildings below. So modern. And in the Double House on Locust Street. And in the Potts Warehouse. Monumental but balanced, crenellation, arches, Gothic pointed arches, and overhang. Also purely creative eclectic. And here's another angle of the tea house. What we didn't realize until we started snooping around was that doorways in the back wall opened up to a path that connected to the superintendent's cottage, so help could serve guests in the tea house. Functional yet beautiful. And here's a view from the tea house, behind walls and yet open to the outdoors. The tea house path leads to the superintendent's cottage. The greenhouses produced award-winning blooms for flower shows, and the greenhouses and orchards provided produce for those who lived on the property. Eventually, this complex would serve the community as wartime gardens, and, as I mentioned earlier, as a horticultural training program for women. This complex required a full-time staff. Later nicknamed Acorn Cottage, this cottage housed the head gardeners and their family. The first superintendent was Francis Canning, who tragically died after eating a poisonous mushroom. And the next, Alexander MacLeod, hired from The Mount, author Edith Wharton's country home. Bodine managed to recruit quite a celebrity in the horticultural world. The cottage was created in the cozy rural aesthetic, surrounded by shrubs, gardens, and a winding path. It was reminiscent of the Cotswold cottage with its hipped roof lines, curved slopes like those of the traditional thatched roofs of English cottages, oversized chimneys, small paned casement windows. Day's work in the English tradition surely grew from a childhood spent exploring the towns and cities of his father's homeland. We know he was smitten by English architecture. For goodness sake, he even sketched the nave at Chilham Church in Kent while mourning his father, who's buried there. Despite its clearly Cotswold look, though, it's an all-American design, a creative eclectic design, a novel arrangement with its tiled roof, a curved dormer under Ionic columns over the front door, a porch with two delicately curved wooden benches. It's constructed of red brick in the monk bond pattern with brick pathways. Brick was the choice material in Philadelphia, fireproof and easily available, vernacular. In brick, this is distinctly American. His desire to create an American Cotswold probably stemmed from his appreciation of local history and architecture, maybe even a result of his own family history. His mother's ancestors were some of the first Swedish settlers in the area. We're going to detour for a minute so I can better share evidence of his appreciation of American colonial architecture. On several occasions, we see his recycling historical elements into his new designs. He salvaged historic courthouse columns for a YMCA, this one in Jim Thorpe, Mochunk then. For a new colonial revival clubhouse for Sons of St. George Society, a group that supported British immigrants of which his father had been a member, Day used the statue of St. George from the original Strickland design. And Day was involved in several preservation projects throughout his career. Frank and Anna fought to preserve the 1803 Federal-style Worcester Mansion in Germantown at Vernon Park, wishing to preserve the park as a memorial to those lost in the Battle of Germantown. This was a big deal, a big to-do with the city, who wanted to tear down the home in order to use the park for other purposes, including a library. The day's fight saved the Worcester Mansion, and it was used to house the Sight and Relic, which morphed into the Historical Society. Thanks to them, the Worcester House still stands to house the Black Writers Society. Day had numerous projects rehabbing or renovating historic spaces. One of his first projects was to design offices for Sugar King of California, one of several of the city's most wealthy executives whose headquarters were located within William Strickland's historic Greek Revival Merchant Exchange building, now the home to the National Park Service. Between about 1900 and 1913, Day led a massive restoration of Congress Hall, the home of our first government, and it was one of the country's most impressive historical preservations of the time. Congress Hall was taken apart and put back together again. Original paints, woods, layers of wallpaper, room designs were investigated, and the building was repaired entirely. Following Worcester and Congress Hall was the rehab of the Haynes residence, or the Wick, another Strickland design. Wick means white in Welsh, and it's a whitewashed farmhouse on Germantown Ave. The original home was built in the 1690s, and Strickland made major alterations in 1824. The rehabbed gardens, arbors, and trellises were Day's addition. This was really the beginning of Day's affinity for the Pennsylvania farmhouse as well, and he would have many commissions remodeling historic farmhouses, transforming them into country estates, such as the Thompson residence or Brookwood Farm in Greenville, where many wealthy families like the DuPonts were building country estates. I spent a lot of energy trying to figure out Brookwood and if it still stands. All I could scrounge up was a bookplate, but it's special. It was created by Bertha Corson Day, Day's niece, who studied illustration under Howard Pyle. His own home, Hickory Hill, an old Victorian farmhouse at Mount Airy Ave on the edge of Fairmount Park. He rebuilt this home in the farmhouse style of the Wick, maintained the original hearth and other original features, but you see he transformed the facade entirely. The previously mentioned redesign of a farmhouse for his sisters-in-laws in Ambler, currently the administrative offices for the Upper Dublin School District on the edge of the Temple Ambler campus. And we're back. In addition to the vernacular materials and American take on the Cotswold, there are some architectural features associated with colonial architecture that he repeated in many other designs, like at St. George's we just saw, the denticulated cornice, first used in an expansion of St. Christopher's Children's Hospital, built in the colonial revival style as the original hospital to serve the people of Kensington, and now affordable housing across from De Burgos Elementary. And colonial features so often seen in his other designs. Eventually, when the Days realized they would lose the fight to build a library at Vernon Park, Frank agreed to design the library himself, as well as the Soldiers' Monument. More colonial revival features in the 1909 medical school facilities at Yale, and in his later designs as supervising architect at the University of Delaware. He traveled all over Delaware, choosing vernacular motifs to create a uniquely Delaware colonial revival campus. Now back to Lower Merion. The interior of the cottage at Stoneleigh Oakwell was quaint and practical, with simple paneled walls and doors, built-in closets and cabinets, deep windowsills, paneled doors, and wood floors. The cottage is set up on a hill, separated by mature trees and gardens. Every window has bright light and beautiful views, and it feels like you're in a treehouse. These deep sills are like those of Cogsley and in his own home that proved a beautiful backdrop for illustrations. Just below the cottage was a greenhouse complex, a grouping of glass greenhouses, garden sheds, workshops, and stables. The garden sheds were quaint little houses with curved porticos set over the doors and carved stepped gables ornamented by stone globe finials. The view of the facade, taken by Sean McMurtry, but on the same day I first toured Oakwell. The structure's brick walls created firm boundaries, defining the borders, while the open doorways, arches, and pergola drew the visitor in, and from within conveyed openness to the outdoors. With Romanesque arches and finials like those seen at the Madison Free Library or Carnegie Library, home to the first training program for women in Wisconsin, at the Newbold Residence or Castle on Locust Street, in the design for Houston Hall on the Penn campus, the first student union on an American campus dedicated in 1896. Arches, arched windows, doors, reminiscent of those seen in the museum building for the University of Pennsylvania, which was really the culmination of Day's first stylistic period and a collaborative effort of the Philadelphia Creative Eclectics, Frank Miles Day, Wilson Eyre, and Cope Stewardson. Day's firm was appointed architects in charge here, and Day personally managed all administration and was responsible for the brickwork, modern technologies, and the Spanish and Italian influence, all of which we see at Oakwell. There were the arches of a warehouse, interestingly just opposite from the Penn Museum across the Schuylkill River. Arches in the Byzantine-styled interior for John MacArthur Jr.'s church on Spruce, Day's major renovation of the tallest building in Philadelphia at that time. It had a spire back then. And of course, the stadium constructed behind Waitman Hall, now known as Franklin Field. Day's arches are everywhere. Now back to the garden complex. The one-story brick building contained the stable, tool shed, and a boiler room, while rustic barn doors and enormous structural beams in a basement that housed a huge plumbing system that served this entire complex. These buildings were delicate and architecturally interesting. They featured the same brick bond as the cottage and intricately designed hardware and complicated curved Jacobean-style arches. Windows were arched with starburst panes, just like the classical starbursts on doors to light the garden sheds. A motif he applied to the Bedford Springs Hotel, now an Omni hotel you can visit. Starbursts adjoining the walkways that led to the different springs which had drawn guests to this hotel for years. City dwellers flocked during the summer months for their medicinal powers. And starbursts on the rails and windows of the impressive solarium. A solarium which, I noticed, is reminiscent of Flagler's Floridian pool complex. Perhaps no coincidence considering his work in St. Augustine with Warden. All the structures at Stoneleigh Oakwell are superb examples of Day's expertise in brickwork. And Day was truly a master of brickwork. In 1895, Day published Suggestions in Brickwork, his own catalog, really a volume, that would allow for the incorporation of the styles and motifs noted on his travels into new, well-engineered American architecture. Intricate brickwork designs made available to the people. Interestingly, in the same year as Suggestions in Brickwork, Day was swept up by McKim and participated in the establishment of the American Academy in Rome and made fellow of the American Institute of Architects. And I think there's something special about this simultaneous interest in the past and modernity. Behind these walls were stables, and beyond the stables and workroom were the greenhouses. While a tennis court replaced the greenhouses eventually, you can still see some of the beds for cold frame gardening built into the garden wall. And within the greenhouses were modern plumbing and iron framing and piping. Here, the master gardeners and their teams grew award-winning flowers, hyacinths, chrysanthemums, and vegetables like celery, beets, and cabbage to exhibit at the Pennsylvania Horticulture Society's flower shows in Horticultural Hall, also one of Day's designs, as well as at Rittenhouse Park. Equipped with the latest irrigation technology, which looks archaic now but was modern at the time, and even included a flush-o-matic toilet and the tiniest little sink we ever saw, but novelties. And the basement had this monster of a boiler that provided heat to the complex and to the cottage. More modern technology. Day was your guy if you wanted high tech, and we see examples of this throughout his career. with the Medico Chirurgical Building, a little building with a lot of hype, a state-of-the-art medical facility, the newest technologies. On a much larger scale, a massive seaside resort, begun by Dr. Bennett of St. Christopher's, a state-of-the-art nursing facility where women and children could vacation free of charge. A modern gymnasium for Penn, along with these two elite prep schools, Chestnut Hill and Mercersburg academies. Pharmaceutical factories, along with many others. In his later career, this 8-story, 140,000 square foot brick design, a thoroughly modern factory building, as it was the first precast concrete structure in Philadelphia, now Independence Bluffs. All of the Stoneleigh Oakwell greenhouse complex buildings were enclosed within a distinct area, tidily confined by a brick wall behind a pergola, under an open colonnade of paired columns between two garden sheds with seating for garden guests. This concept of incorporating a pergola into a utilitarian wall was patterned after a suggestion by Gertrude Jekyll. Surface areas should be enclosed in walls that were both useful and decorative, and an innovative solution to one of the problems of garden architecture, integrating the ornamental and functional aspects of garden design. These square holes on the complex facade would have held those beams for the pergola. And this pergola is a perfect example of Day's ability to connect indoor and outdoor spaces. Quite similar to that which she created at Seven Oaks. After their marriage, Anna and Frank moved to the Mount Airy section of Philadelphia. They rented a home which they named Seven Oaks after a town in Kent. You can see that while they couldn't adapt a rental home, they quickly transformed the gardens. My daughter Greta and I visited his home at Hickory Hill for an event with the Chestnut Hill Conservancy last fall and experienced this connectedness to the outdoors for ourselves. Though hard to see in this photo, French doors open up to patios and gardens in every direction. He planted a combination of formal and natural gardens with many features that are still intact today, like these terracotta wine jugs, and native plants found on his local botanizing trips, scavenging for native plants, the log pictured here. And he designed a bridge over the Wissahickon for the Parks Department while I was at it, blending art and nature. We took this photo on a hike in the Wissahickon, which, by the way, the Days fought to preserve. Hickory Hill was his full-time home, and what a retreat. He was committed to connecting house and garden in architectural designs and here with a magazine he founded in the same year, 1901, with Herbert Wise and Wilson Eyre, in which they featured architecture at home and abroad, some of which you may recognize. This was all part of his effort to share ideas with the public, as with suggestions in brickwork, and to elevate the field of architecture in the eyes of the public by providing examples of homes with notable landscape designs. Day lectured on the importance of providing Philadelphians with more green space for health benefits, connecting city dwellers with nature. In his spare time, Day co-authored American Park System's Report of the Philadelphia Allied Organizations, a call for a better public park system in Philadelphia. And I think you'll like this. You've seen the result of his imaginings. He imagined a main thoroughfare, Broad Street, connecting downtown to a green space along the river. Construction of League Island Park began during his lifetime, and it's now called FDR Park. In 1913, the Olmsted brothers were hired to design the landscape. This area continues to be the only significant amount of green space left in Philadelphia, a result of his vision. So that's it for the complex of Villanova. The vernacular meets European, Asian, classical motifs, practical structures set into the landscape, a functional and beautiful green space, soon accessible to the public thanks to natural lands. Another park for the people. The next two examples of Day's architecture in Lower Merion you've probably been driving by for years. They're on Montgomery Ave in Wynwood, directly opposite Mainline Reformed Temple, between the lights at Cherry Lane and Gypsy Lane. I still chuckle at their close proximity to the Lower Merion School District buildings. Pat Keebler wrote a letter in support of preservation of the structures at Oakwell, suggesting school district officials should take a walk down the block to experience more of Day's work. And these are those structures, 1907 designs. For the Robert Hale residence, they blended two styles, Jacobean and American Georgian. The brick gables and bays of the front garden and garden facades and the irregular massing and shapes create asymmetrical balance and recall Tudor Jacobean manor houses. Double-hung sash windows with white frames, dark shutters. Jacob Hale's residence next door has simpler massing, but is more sophisticated in composition. While Day used traditional materials, construction, and forms, he simplified forms, stripping them of obvious historical references. He grouped them in modern ways, groups of windows in narrow horizontal rows, a single protruding two-story bay from a flat facade, resulting in more dramatic asymmetry. And these are forms we see in other designs. At Waitman Hall, Collegiate Gothic had become the favorite style of the University of Pennsylvania and educational institutions in general. The style embodied the high academic standards, stability, the tradition of Oxford and Cambridge. And similar forms in Day's Tudor Jacobean manor, built like a stone castle for brewer Charles Bergner. Jacobean forms were popular, but Day replaced the vertical forms with a long, low silhouette resting in the landscape, following the slope of the land. Curved stone and terrace walls like fortification. Like those at the Newbold residence, as we saw at Houston Hall, and windows similar to those we see in his most well-known Philadelphia townhouse, the Yarnall residence, aka the House of Wisdom, which took about 2 years to build. Quite lovely. Have another peek at the interior. The first floor reception room capped by a dome and stained glass, lunette murals, all designed by Oakley, whom Yarnall recruited after seeing her work at the Pennsylvania State Capitol. More Gothic forms in Day's large-scale university design at Princeton and at the Furness Library in Wallingford, a modest building, native stone, gables, built in memory of Frank Furness's brother, Horace Howard's wife, Helen Kate, who was, like Horace Howard, a Shakespearean expert. This is appropriately Edwardian style. The Hale residences are great examples of Day's use of Jacobean and Gothic forms, which we see in so much of his collegiate architecture, as well as examples of his use of picturesque massing. One of his last residential designs was another residence in Merion, Sogno Mio, Italian for my dream. The estate was built for John Braun. The 18-room stone residence resembled an Italian villa with flat and asymmetrical facade in a delicate pink stucco, ornamented with shields, lunettes, and a dramatic bracket portico over the entryway. Essentially, classical in inspiration, symmetrical and with coining, heavy blocky masses, ionic columns supporting the end porch, and a solid balcony wall, a different arrangement of forms generally used by Day. In his taste, however, is the home's connection to the outdoors. French doors open from nearly every room to balconies on the front. A buttressed side balcony, porches, a wide terrace, secluded sunken gardens with a swimming pool. The Italian influence, delicate terracotta details, and a clay roof harken back to Day's earliest work, the Art Club, and those on the tea house at Oakwell. Day was truly a master of terracotta design. Much of his work advertised in the Conkling Armstrong catalogs, and Sogno Mio is his last example of this type of work. There are many examples of terracotta on his city residences, townhouses designed for several of Philadelphia's more prominent businessmen. Check it out when you head into the Black Sheep pub when it hopefully reopens after a recent fire. Or at the Kaner residence on Walnut, now Blue Mercury, and surely the most interesting architectural detail in any Blue Mercury around. Or at the Edding residence. Or at a country estate in Mount Airy, Germantown, a recently restored home with extraordinary terracotta work. And then there was Horticultural Hall on Broad on the south side of the Academy of Music. More Italian motifs, ocular windows under deep eaves, ornate terracotta work. and on the skyscraper, or tall high-rise, for the American Baptist Publishing Society, which you can also visit today, which is based on his sketches of the great towers of Germany recorded while traveling through Regensburg and Nuremberg. But back to Sonio Mio. This design, like all of Day's houses, from the earliest designs to the latest, was a tangible illustration of his belief expressed in country homes and gardens of moderate cost, that, if the plan be a simple and direct expression of the needs and life of the people who are to live in the house, and if the elevations are a logical outgrowth from a reasonable expression of that plan, and if the whole be made beautiful and vocal of its time and place, then the building will have style in the best sense. While this wasn't necessarily of moderate cost, it was open and airy as a summer house, doors opening up onto gardens. Braun was a manufacturer in leather, cement, and the head of the Pennsylvania Lawn Mower Works. His real passion was, however, the arts. He was a tenor and a nationally known concert singer. He was a patron of music and art, active in the development of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and a frequent lecturer on American painting. His first wife died during the construction of the home, but he lived here with his second wife, Edith, a pianist he married in 1920, until his death in 1939. He was an art collector and amassed an enormous art collection. Whistler's Harmony in Gray and Peach Color can be seen to the right of the music room window. I suspect Day and Braun knew each other from the art world. Sonio Mio is one of Day's many large country estates. For this type of residential design, he never once used the same style facade or footprint. Each one, however, a modern take on a European estate. Colony House was a take on the English vernacular tradition, with stucco trimmed with red brick, stone porch pillars, plaster walls, tall brick chimneys, cottagesque half timbering, leaded casements, and bracketed overhangs. Similar to the Hale homes, but larger, longer lines, horizontal fenestration, an unadorned surface that recalls Day's own Pennsylvania farmhouse. The French chateau style with coordinated carriage houses, Georgian outbuildings, including these stables for Trumbauer's Crosswicks, pictured on the left. Notice the symmetry. Ornamentation is restrained but classical, and once again, he couldn't resist throwing in some arches. And here's a fun aside. While digging, I was excited to find the landscape design was the first of the legendary Beatrix Farrand, who happened to be Newbold's niece. Given Day's record, attention to landscape, and interested in pastoral landscape, combined with Farrand's support of the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women, a Day Blakiston cause, it's likely Day and Farrand collaborated here. Connections everywhere. We started off in Lower Merion with our Oakwell tour back in 2022, and that's where we'll end for this presentation. It's exciting realizing such stunning examples of his architecture exist right here in Lower Merion, representing his different periods and styles, and also beautifully maintained. After taking this spin around Lower Merion, I hope you're interested in Day's life and work, and maybe you'll even go out and explore his works. As I mentioned, Day spent much energy trying to convince universities and architectural institutions to provide funding for students to travel abroad. Just as he recognized the importance of studying classical architecture, I hope that by exploring his creative works right here on our soil, we can better grasp, in his words, as facts, not as shadows, an understanding of mass and proportion, good detail, self-restraint, and appropriate materials. Like Day, I feel it's important to reflect on and appreciate the past and support preservation of historic places, even as we go forward with new development and new reforms. If you're interested in exploring further on your phone or on the ground, this QR code on the left leads to the map with his extant and demolished works. And on the right is a copy of my book, which you can purchase on Amazon in Kindle, paperback, or hardcover form. There's much I left out that's included between its covers. And as I note here, I hope you'll consider looking into your own family and places, maybe even nominating historic property to the local or national register like we did. Anything is possible. And I hope you'll be in touch with any questions or comments. Here's my email address. Thank you very much, and thank you especially to the Lower Merion Historical Society for this opportunity to share. Take care.